Hi there all, thank you for joining us today. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We can just see a few more attendees jumping on, but we've got a good amount with us so far. But if you'd just like to bear with us another minute or two, we'll just let the last few trickle in and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we've still got a few more just coming in, but so we don't start unpromptly. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning on this call. This is one of the a series of sessions that we've been supporting and holding over the last number of weeks. So just as a way of quick introductions as well for the call today, this is going to be very much an advisory call, and the subject that we're going to be covering off is how you can extend your current management capabilities out across the internet in terms of in a remote management scenario as well. So what kind of options exist for you? In terms of just giving you a quick way of introductions for the session today, essentially you will be joined by a couple of speakers from Power On. Just as a quick way of introduction, I'll just ask for each of the speakers to introduce themselves. So I will just start with myself. So Phil Mercer, I'm the managing director at Power On, but I always like to be pretty hands-on, relevant to customer side of things. So I often act in the format of something we call a business consultant. So I tend to have my strapline of saying I'm technical but not the techie, but do a lot of help in terms of supporting customers in terms of determining their kind of strategy of approach and what kind of makes sense based on the fit and the need that they have at that point in time. But Steve, you would like to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. So hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Beaumont. I'm the CTO at Power On Platforms and general technical geek when it comes to everything systems management. And I'll hand over to Heinrich.
Good morning, thanks Steve. My name is Heinrich Pelser. I'm part of the sort of solutions team here at Power On, business consultant. My job's probably one of the easiest ones within the actual team here. Fairly simple, just to understand, for sort of basic needs of clients, and then, put the relevant bits and pieces in place, obviously drive that forward.
Brilliant, thanks all. So just to get into then the actual details of the session today, so just a simple agenda, the real, well, I'll just cover off a little bit of how we want the format of the session to run today, just so you guys know how you can interact with us, but also then, the kind of the two primary areas that we're going to be talking around today kind of consist of extending Configuration Manager out with cloud management gateways, and then looking towards the modern approaches with Intune for Windows 10 management. And then really we'll be diving into an open Q&A for the bigger part of the session. So just kind of talking to that in terms of, for the session itself, as I mentioned, this is a series that we've been holding. The purpose of these sessions really is to help share knowledge. So there's no real intended sales pitch or anything like that with this. They are very much geared around open format, free kind of discussion in respect of what we're kind of looking to cover off. So with the nature of the way that we then deliver these, we're looking to kind of pick on different topics that either customers have asked us about or that we've seen that has been kind of effectively or needed from kind of customer organizations that we've been working with over the last several weeks, and of course, to be honest with you, over the previous time. But in the last several weeks, things have become obviously a little bit more focused, shall we say, and relevant to the works that we've been doing for quite a while around remote management and otherwise. So what we like to do with that then is essentially provide a session kind of opener. So the next sessions we'll have is we'll just kind of talk you through kind of a high level of the scenario, the architecture, the considerations, the different moving parts that effectively will be part of the process of how you could start to realize or use those technologies in situ. But really that's geared around building towards then the Q&A. So we wanted to try and give you obviously food for thought, make sure that we kind of cover off probably what a lot of the questions we've either had previously or you may have in your mind. But essentially then we'll dive into the Q&A, and we do want that really to be interactive. So we're all here just to kind of share knowledge and learn. So please do feel free to come forwards with your questions. You know, your questions are welcome and actually really the thing that we need from this. So please don't be shy about kind of putting your questions forward to us. It's an opportunity to kind of get those pieces answered for you. What we'll most likely do is probably hold any questions that you ask us through the session to that Q&A, though we might dive into a question during the course of the update of the content anyway. But what I would suggest is if you have any questions, just drop them into the question boxes. You know, we can either kind of do a quick response there, or what we'll do is we'll, as I say, hold it to the kind of Q&A part of the day or the session. And then we'll kind of really just take it from there. But do feel free to throw in your questions, anything that comes to mind and all that kind of good stuff, because like I say, the interaction will really drive the larger value for you with this. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Steve, who's going to kind of take us through the first session for us in terms of the Configuration Manager Cloud Management Gateways.
Thank you very much, Phil. So this is a topic that is absolutely very dear to my heart because it's one of the, oops, sorry, Phil, can you just pop that slide back on again?
I've noticed it's just dropped out. Bear with me a second. Not sure why that did that.
Well, Phil saw it outside. So this is one of the topics that is really dear to my heart because it's both a really interesting piece of technology that Microsoft introduced with some of the improvements in Config Manager, but also from a business perspective, being able to easily start to reach out to clients that are across on the internet. Do you want me to share my screen, Phil?
Yeah, bear with me a second. I'm not entirely sure why that's suddenly dropped out because all I did was minimize my meeting manager frame. But bear with me a moment. Is that now coming back up as it should?
Yes, it is.
All right, okay. I will not press any other buttons then.
So being able to reach out to clients wherever they are, as long as they have an internet connection, so not having to rely specifically on VPN connections, but being able to leverage something that is up in the cloud is a really nice and unique piece of technology from Microsoft, leveraging that idea of the cloud scale. Now, there's a couple of different use case scenarios on here. So being able to manage, I would like to say just Windows 10, but it's not just Windows 10 because we absolutely appreciate there are still some organizations that are doing their transition piece still. So this will also actively work on Windows 7 machines. But being able to cover the fact that whether it's domain joined, whether it is what we call hybrid joined, so registered with Azure Active Directory as well as on-premise Active Directory, or whether it is either just a born in the cloud device just on Azure Active Directory, or even workgroup computers, means that we pretty much have all of the different bases covered. So when you do have, and especially in this current climate, lots of remote working devices, so these are primarily going to be targeted at your corporate devices. This is not necessarily something you do for bring your own device scenarios and so on. But when somebody either goes and takes that desktop that's usually sat in the office all the time, takes it home to work, or takes their laptop and goes roaming, and they don't have the VPN connections, or even if they do, supplementing the ability to be able to reach out to them, contact them, still get inventory information off them, still be able to patch them, still be able to do lots of different features that I'll come on to next, but in short, being able to manage them devices is brilliant. So also extending it to the case of where you might have these remote offices which don't have site-to-site VPNs, or they might have an internet breakout where you want to be able to do the management piece down there to limit or allow the site-to-site connections to have more bandwidth for things like normal file activity, SharePoint, and so on, is again another scenario that this can potentially work in. Now, the deployment side of it, Well, it's a little bit more involved than just the 3 bullet points on screen, but from a very high level, the main concepts is that we deploy the CMG cloud service to Azure, and this is an Azure service. I'll dive into that in a minute. We add the connection point to your current ConfigMgr infrastructure. That's where the service is going to then be talked to or talked from. So this is a dial out, as I'll come on to. And then we configure the various site roles within your organization to say, right, fine, we want software updates to be able to flow through it. We want to be able to talk to these management points. And then in essence, it's set up and correct. Now, I'll come on to in a couple of slides time, just a couple of things that you've gone probably, well, that sounds a little bit too easy. And I'll make the clear distinction of why it's a lot easier than some of the previous legacy, not attempts, but methods of doing this. If we can go, oh, you beat me to it, Phil. So on the actual features and stuff that we can talk around on that side of what it actually does provide. Now, there's lots of obviously green ticks within here, and that's to say that Microsoft keep on increasing the amount of stuff that you can do through the CMG. Now, it won't ever do everything. It's not designed to be a completely right, exactly as you have it on premise. You can now do anywhere from a cloud perspective. But the main thing is the main key features that are allowed or is capable of being done through the CMG revolve around the day-to-day management tasks of making sure that we can see and inventory the devices. So being able to bring that inventory back in allows us to make intelligent decisions on the devices, which feeds into the other aspects such as being able to distribute software. So everything is predicated on inventory. We can't do stuff if we don't know what it is we're attempting to target and do, and whether it's already there and installed, etc. So being able to deploy an application. So if a user is at home and they go all of a sudden, right, I've been invited to go and jump onto a Zoom meeting, I need the Zoom client, push it down via the cloud. Software updates. So being able to make sure that we're patching in this climate and ongoing as well is absolutely critical. So even if the device is not coming into the office often, doesn't have a VPN connection, we can still make sure that we control which patches, when, where, and how often, etc., that we want to deploy down to the devices directly from Microsoft, but leveraging the control mechanisms in ConfigMgr. Compliance, etc. and stuff, yeah, fine. We want to make sure that any rules that we're putting in there is all there and in place. But the interesting bit is around the in-place task sequences. So being able to do things like your Windows as a service routines, so either via servicing rings for the software update mechanism, or in a more controlled and structured fashion via the task sequences, being able to run them and deliver the content and the control through the cloud management gateway, and making sure that the impacted time when devices are away from your core network doesn't hinder your ability to keep them modern and fresh. Now, there are some bits that obviously you're not going to be able to do. You can't just click a button and push the ConfigMgr agent out to all your devices that aren't currently connected. That's just not going to work. We can't wake them devices up from sleep because we don't have a direct connection to them that's always established. And it doesn't support non-Windows devices. Now, the interesting bit on there, just to finish off on that one, is the CM Pivot one, and that's something that is gaining a lot more popularity and interest in terms of a new feature in ConfigMgr of being able to do real-time querying of devices and being able to flush that out through the actual the CMG, and being able to go and run them on demand whenever you need them. Now, if we have a look at what the actual infrastructure starts to look like of how it's strung together, we can see there's a couple of different moving parts within this solution. Now, going back to that first slide that I mentioned around on the 3 main components. So the main thing is, and I'll go out of order on this one if it makes sense for now. So point number 2 on the slide around that cloud management gateway. So this is an actual Azure cloud service. So it's not just spin up a VM and go and install some components. So you actually commission this from within the ConfigMgr console, give it an account, etc., that it has permissions to go and interact with the Azure service, and then it spins up this very specific thing known as a cloud service or within Azure. Now that allows it to do some really neat things around scaling and so on, but also makes it a hands-off PaaS service for you. So there's bits and pieces that are sat in the cloud that you don't need joined to your domain, you don't have interaction with it, you don't manage. It is run as a service by Microsoft, and then the ConfigMgr service basically reaches out to that from your internal network. So this is probably the biggest benefit, is you're not drilling lots of holes back into your environment. You don't need to have stuff staged within your DMZ and then have specific ports open left, right, and center that you are then subject to having to manage. It's hosted in Azure, it's run as a cloud service, and then your connection points are then what dial out to the service in Azure to go and either request information from incoming clients, establish that tunnel for communication channels, and basically manage it as an outgoing connection. So there's two things. The service connection point is the bit that goes and manages the Azure side of it, makes sure that the updates to the cloud service are done, provisions it, communicates with it. And then the CMG connection point is the piece where it comes back into the on-prem or out from the on-premise, talks to the cloud management gateway, and controls access to things like the management points and the software update points from your traditional on-premise infrastructure to allow the communication flow, so that when a client requests policy, wants to know what software updates, it basically acts as like that reverse proxying piece to be able to bring that information in, request it on behalf of the client, and then push it back out to the cloud management gateway for that roaming laptop to go and then request. Now, in terms of the software distribution, so the actual content of applications and stuff, again, that's hosted up in Azure as part of the cloud management gateway, as part of the underlying storage, so what we'd refer to as the cloud distribution point. But the clients then, when they're told, right, here you are eligible for this application, you've requested it and we're approving it, you can then go and get your content from here, which is the cloud, so it doesn't come and get in, drag that bandwidth from your internal network. So again, you're leveraging Microsoft's bandwidth, then your internet connection pipe. So it allows that to be again freed up for things like voice over IP and general work activities to happen. So if we move on to what the actual requirements on the back end are to be able to establish this type of stuff, then quite rightly, I've mentioned it and I've labored the point a couple of times, you absolutely need to have an Azure subscription to be able to host the CMG. So this is not something that you can go and establish within, if you have an existing Amazon subscription, etc. It has to be deployed into Azure. It's using Microsoft technologies, and Microsoft interact heavily with their backend APIs and stuff to be able to run this. You do need to have a full account within the ConfigMgr infrastructure. Now, it sounds like something that's kind of obvious to say. However, there's been times where if you have custom role breakdowns, etc., you'll find that they are sometimes not actually full admins, but it's a little point to labor on, but it's an important bit as we see some organizations try to attempt this and realize that their RBAC security roles and stuff sometimes hamper them. Now, quite rightly, again, you're going to have permissions and stuff within Azure to be able to deploy it. It's creating stuff within your subscription. You need to give it something that has permissions to be able to go and do that side of it. Now, I mentioned some of the other bits around the fact that we need to have connections to that on-premise side. So yes, on your ConfigMgr infrastructure, you need to elect which server is going to need to talk out to the service. And there is a distinction between having it as an online connection point versus an offline. So if you are in that type of world where you're limiting how much that your internal servers will go out and talk to Microsoft, this won't work. In those air-gapped environments, this won't work. This has to have that online connection to Microsoft to be able to do it. So some of the other bits are kind of side notes, but yes, it can integrate with Azure AD for authentication. It works better on that side. So as you get to more modern approach with Windows 10, etc., it will obviously leverage them requirements, because then it avoids certain requirements on the clients around PKI requirements, although it's probably recommended for now until there's some more improvements coming in around using certificate-based authentication, but leveraging the Azure AD side as well does make sense. and clients must use IPv4. So unless you have a really up-to-date internet provider, most clients are going to have an IPv4 address to be able to access this. And the port requirements from going out of your environment are a bare minimum 433, so the normal SSL channels that most servers are allowed out on. But then as you scale the backend CMG service, so as you want to be able to support more and more quantity of devices, then it does bring in some port requirements around 10,240 and above from memory. But there's a bare minimum that you need, bare minimal requirements to be able to actually provide this service. Now, in terms of actually thinking around how we extend out the deployment considerations for the CMG, if you go to the next slide for us, please, Phil. Now, there are some costs going to obviously be involved within this. So with it running up in Azure, there are some compute, storage, and bandwidth costs to consider. Now, these are actually, in the grand scheme of things, fairly minimal. So other options for doing stuff like this, where you start to look at commissioning your own VMs and you're running it either up in things like Amazon, you obviously always need to pay for them compute storage costs. The offset against using your bandwidth going out of your environment and being able to offload that and sometimes pay for it. When I say minimal, you can look at, for an average number, say 4,000 or 6,000 connected concurrent clients with a decent amount of storage, is relatively low, with a minimal offset of around about 70 defined for the cloud management gateway per month. And then there's a variable cost on the bandwidth and the storage. But again, Microsoft tend to say is around the cost of a cup of coffee for a month per device. But that is something that's fairly easy to model out in terms of the expected costs, but then just working out on how much applications and stuff you expect to actually transfer. In terms of performance and scale, though, the one thing that does come up quite often is there is no regional awareness for this. So it's not as if you can start to drop a CMG in Asia Pacific or one across in the US and then one in the UK to handle it. ConfigMgr clients don't know where they're coming in from as such at present. So it's a case of they will be told that there is a series of different CMGs that are available, and then it will pick one. Now, it will tend to stay with that one for quite some time, so depending on when you spin it up and how you try to do fancy things with restricting it, you can try to point it out, but it is not out of the box, and it is not something that is just geolocation aware. Now, that's to be said, it's often not too much of a worry. You will generally try to put your CMGs closest to where your ConfigMgr infrastructure lives anyway, to make sure that the latency minimization between your core on-premises infrastructure and your Azure service is minimized. And then clients will just connect across the Microsoft backbone more than anything. So it's not too bad on that side. Now, mentioned a couple of times around that idea of scaling the service, and you tend to scale out the service. So you add on number of VMs. So the cloud service itself can quite easily scale, and it's just a case of in the console saying what scale factor you want. Do you want one backend VM, 2, 3, 4, depending on the number of clients, rather than going in and saying, well, actually, I need to give it more memory, more disk, more CPU. That's not a consideration side. So you don't worry about scaling up, you just scale out the quantity that you need for this. As mentioned before, that incoming connections, while it's not geo-regional, obviously as it's hitting the Microsoft service, then depending on the scale factor you have behind the CMG, Microsoft worry about distributing them connections between the different CMG points. So they handle that side nicely for you. It goes round in that round robin side of it. And then even if you do start to max the number of supported clients per CMG, then it's not just suddenly going to drop dead in the water. You're just going to start to see you have to wait as clients cycle through the requests, as more ports become freed up, then the request will get serviced. We always talk around ConfigMgr not being a absolutely do it now situation scenario. You generally use ConfigMgr to plan out, to send out stuff in a managed fashion. So you know how often and how long your deployment windows and schedules are going to be, and the devices will generally cycle through and get it done within them windows as long as you plan it. If not, you start to scale it just so you can make sure that you do meet them peaks in demands, and you can always scale it up and scale it down as required. So that's probably enough for me talking for now, and a ton of information that I've just dumped. As we start to go through this, obviously I'm going to be monitoring the chat channel. If there are questions that you've got, do please start to ask them. I can always either look at them or we can start to answer them towards the end, but please do ask questions about some of that lot that we've just been talking about. And I'll probably start to look to hand over to Heinrich to go into some of the extended modern Windows 10 Intune management.
Yeah, just a couple of points that I was going to make as well, just in terms of some of the last mentions. One thing to be aware of relevant to costs or just relevant to the Azure side is this works on still the classic kind of Azure resource management side of things. So what that means is that you would need to have an Azure subscription that is not being purchased via a CSP, so a cloud solution provider. The cloud management gateways are currently not supported in an Azure tenant that has been acquired through a CSP agreement. So it needs to be bought under either a normal pay-as-you-go enterprise agreement or, kind of an associative volume license contract is just something to be aware of.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and then equally as well, although the CMGs are fundamentally kind of an internet-based distribution side, they do heavily leverage the content distribution capabilities of Microsoft. And so although you will get initial kind of outbound data transfer for down to site locations, down to different branch elements as well, you will find as well, if we make sure, or you make sure you start to take advantage of things like branch cache, that you can get then significant data transfer benefits or compression or basically reduction. So actually your ongoing data transfer costs can be considerably decreased in terms of by leveraging the relevant Microsoft content distribution side, and also means not everything's coming over the wire essentially in terms of outbound to your local client estate, depending on where they're sat. So local peering and branch cache can be some really great benefits, but we could always talk a little bit more to that in the Q&A, depending on what you'd like to know more of. But great. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Steve. And we'll just jump on then to the next element of the session. So we're just going to cover now in terms of, we've looked at, say, what Microsoft may class as some of the traditional, or what would be kind of typically referred to as the enterprise kind of management tooling, so the configuration manager estate, and then looking now towards where some of the modern management approaches are coming in terms of the mobile management approaches, leveraging Intune with Windows 10 as well. So Heinrich, if you'd like to kind of lead the way.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Steve and Phil. In terms of the modern management approaches and recommended approaches we're seeing, it's always been a bit of a sort of tough landscape, I would argue, for organizations to start thinking about a sort of transition plan. It's also something that from a communications perspective, Microsoft hasn't made particularly easy over time by really not making their mind up as to what that means on the other end, right? So there's this initial sort of cloud first mentality they put out there initially where they said, look, just close your eyes and just go for it. We sort of saw that being more adopted by new businesses as well, right? So sort of hopping over to a fully fledged, beautifully sort of automated Intune environment, and obviously takes a lot of work and consideration for sort of traditional environments, traditional businesses. But I would argue, modern or sort of new fledgling businesses, are more likely to adopt an approach like that, right? In terms of that transition, obviously there's a lot of things we have to consider as part of that. We've got things like Active Directory and group policy and our settings and our management and our file servers and printing and all these types of things that we need to think about that are traditionally accessed, within our ring fenced, our sort of safety net, with our firewall around everything. But as the world changes, specifically, ironically, because of this COVID situation we're in as well, we're finding the need for management outside of that perimeter is becoming more and more pressing. Plus, as well, coupled that with obviously sort of recent business change, we're sort of seeing this path to modern management really, sort of coming to fruition at the moment as well, right? So you find organizations look at this approach, and that, you know, we as Powron also help organizations sort of perform this switch in a couple of ways. You could go cloud first. Absolutely, you could. You can go straight into it should you so desire. Organizations, if you look at it from a holistic perspective, you'll sort of find that you're trying to do everything for everyone in that regard, you know, but there could be subsections of your business or new as acquisitions come in that may fit that particular purpose, right? And then having the flexibility to go either one or the other is obviously a big thing. There's the big switch transition we've seen as well. That's, for example, where organizations, you know, are sort of in this massive sort of change where they purchase M365 and E5 and all these types of things, and the sort of need or the want for adoption is very, very high, and it's obviously very, very challenging, you know, for sort of a number of reasons. Getting things into the cloud from the get-go can be quite a challenge. There's a lot of compliance, regulatory things you need to think about that as well. Office 365, these modern management approaches, as the guys mentioned earlier as well, around data, trying to make the right decision based on facts is also becoming something we're seeing more of. And then we're sort of finding organizations move towards this group by group transition almost, right? Which is something that we've been, you know, helping organizations do in the adoption of things like Windows 10 by identifying specific parts of the business using things like analytics and thought sort of exercise a lot of the time, and doing our due diligence to make sure that that hop from one part of traditional into the modern world makes sense, and obviously things like risk is really, really mitigated. The nice thing from Microsoft as well in terms of that co-management or that bridge, I don't know if you guys may have seen some of the sort of older stuff from Microsoft they put forward, there was this bridge where you moved on to, has really, you know, sort of never been easier from a technology perspective. On the screen on the right hand side there, you can see it's literally a slider. You could very quickly move certain workloads for certain people from on-premise into the cloud. The big difference there, also from a pilot perspective, you see the middle one as a pilot. That's just where you identify certain areas, you know, that would be sort of, you know, you'd put up for UAT or whatever the case be prior to obviously going forwards and sort of really moving that workload across as well, right? There's some careful considerations, obviously, that needs to be made as part of that, but we're seeing a more aggressive sort of stance with organizations adopting things like modern management, right? Hybrid is still very much the way for lots of organizations, right? That's sort of one foot on the ground with one in the air still in many ways, with organizations who are trying to adopt cloud technology is also going to be a big thing as well, right? But we're finding more and more organizations leveraging that bridge into things like Intune as something, you know, that they really see opens up the doors to new capabilities, as well as then, you know, start to offload some of those on-premise services, you know, towards a cloud-based model as well, right? Can we hop over to the next one there, Phil? So in terms of some of the deployment considerations, right, the enrollment of devices is obviously going to be a big and key thing as part of this. Intune admins have got a couple of ways. There's also some ways for end users to adopt this. So, you know, once everything's been set up in the background, once you've got your Intune subscriptions going and you've configured what you need to configure as part of that, it's not just something that your IT admins have to drive, and I will cover those bits and pieces as well, right? But things, for example, in terms of the BYOD considerations can definitely be made from a Windows perspective. Your end users could be given the capabilities to enroll their own Windows devices as well, right? This typically can happen through things like a work account or a school account, Office 365 account, or Azure Active Directory account. It's a better way of putting this. Where that user registers his or her device into Azure Active Directory to gain corporate resources, you know, like emails and stuff like that. You can also then enroll a personal device should you need to as well, right? And then off the back of that, the end user just goes through the process of entering their credentials. They can also enroll separately should they need to, but it will then allow that end user to get access to relevant bits and pieces that you've made available. Some of the things to consider as part of that, especially if you go down the road, things like conditional access may not be there. More traditional ones from an end user perspective, the end user him or herself can join Azure Active Directory themselves as well, right? Again, from a permission perspective, this is something that your admins can set up in the background. And then should you then wish to kind of go further down the road in terms of that administrative adoption of things like Windows 10 and the enrollment, for example, for Intune, you know, things like Windows 10 automatic enrollment can then also be put in play. So automatic enrollment effectively lets that end user enroll their Windows 10 device into Intune. The user adds their personal account, as we've talked about as well. And then off the back of that, you know, they can access certain resources, and then the actual device will get, you know, certain sets of policies, and then it's then effectively onboarded into the Intune side of things. So that's one of the big differences, I would argue, you know, it sort of goes without saying, between the two platforms. So you heard Steve talk about the CMGs and SCCM and everything else. That's an agent-based solution. So you must have a SCCM agent on that device, whereas with Intune, a lot of that adoption and change is effectively driven from the user end. So things like Azure Active Directory is effectively that onboarding mechanism in many ways, where you can then also do that split between needing to access things on premise through traditional means and resources through the CMGs and stuff that Steve was talking about, and then also hop to this side of the fence as well in terms of you know, making sure that enrollment from an Intune perspective is quite concise, straightforward. CNAME registrations, again, a really big thing. So it's effectively just done to simplify your enrollment. So what you do is you create a domain name, or DNS alias, basically, that redirects your enrollment request to Intune. Otherwise, when the end user enrolls, he or she'll be faced with having to type in the sort of MDM name a lot of the time. So a sort of basic premise, if your company website is like us, PowerOn platform, poweron.com, you'd create a CNAME record in DNS that redirects, I think it's enterpriseenrollment.poweron.com to enterpriseenrollmentmanaged.microsoft.com. So it just means that that onboarding is fairly easy as well. They are optional. CNAME entries are optional, but I'd strongly recommend them because obviously, as I said, if no CNAME record is found, your end users will be, you know, sort of prompted to do things themselves as well, right? Azure Active Directory, Azure Hybrid AD joins lets your admins configure Azure AD groups policies to automatically enroll devices through a hybrid domain join. That can happen from your SCCM builds if you wanted to, or you can go straight to a sort of onboarding experience within Azure Active Directory. It's made really easy in that regard. We'll touch on some of the other bits and pieces as well from Autopilot perspective, because I know that's obviously one of the big things as well. Also some things to note as well. A lot of the bits and pieces we're talking here may not be specific to Intune, and I'll make sure I call those out as we go through some of the Windows 10 bits. But for this instance, the enrollment of devices specifically within the Azure space, you are going to need certain things in place. And depending on things like automatic enrollment and where you want to go, you are going to need to make sure that you have the right relevance in terms of licensing available as well. So Azure Active Directory Premium is going to be required for a lot of this. And then off the back of that, you know, if you wanted to ramp that up fairly quickly as well, then things like bulk enrollment is also going to be something you're going to need to consider. So it just allows your techies to sort of join a large number of new corporate-owned devices into Azure AD and Intune. And then off the back of that, you create these provisioning packages within the WCD, which is the Windows Configuration Designer. And then off the back of that, your sort of USB stick is effectively plugged into the device. You know, and then allows you to install a provisioning package. It just makes sure that that device is customized to your liking as part of that. And then you can start obviously handing those out as well, right? The big thing as well, as I said, licensing is a big thing. So making sure that your end users has permissions in terms of Intunes and your techies have everything they need as well is going to be a big thing. So if you wouldn't mind hopping to the next slide, Mr. Mercer. One of the biggest things we've talked about as well is in terms of traffic management. You heard the guys earlier mention things coming through the pipe. Depending on where organizations are in terms of a VPN or a sort of hybrid approach, even pushing things down the pipe to your devices from a CMG perspective or from an Intune perspective, from Windows Updates for Business perspective, does need some careful consideration, especially around things like the network side, right? So you'll see on the top there, we're talking about things like forced tunneling of VPN versus split tunneling of VPN. The sort of main differences between the two and where you may need to consider your approach to stuff, especially if you're looking at software deployment and patching, is going to be a big thing, because in terms of split tunneling VPN is where it's the concept where you allow that VPN user to access public networks, so like the internet and stuff, and then also the local LAN or WAN at the same time, you know, using a single NIC. You know, so traffic routes need to be considered as part of that. And then things like forced tunneling as well is where you effectively just force everything through a single tunnel. So it's typically designed for things like host-to-host networks, remote access services, or you're connecting root sites to links as well. So making sure that connection and that bandwidth isn't flooded with anything you're pushing down from a corporate level into that device is also going to be something, you know, that needs to be considered. But a lot of this can be mitigated and sort of controlled through built-in metrics from a Windows 10 perspective. So things like Windows 10 delivery optimization should be carefully considered as well. You heard the guys talking about caching as well, peer-to-peer caching. That can happen as well. And then also careful planning. So we as Powron, we work with organizations across the world in different time zones as well. So being mindful of that and how people work and their work patterns and everything else. The tools have done a good job in making sure that we can support those end users fairly quickly in terms of apps as well. So you might find yourself trickling down apps over a period of time. Same thing with things like Windows updates, making sure that doesn't happen on a Monday morning during your sort of first meeting of the day. So maintenance Windows is still a big thing as well. But since pretty much Windows 10 1803, they've made some significant changes as well, right? So in terms of that policy and update and control, I would argue probably 3 key things to consider as part of that. So IT admins have finally been given the sort of ability since then to separate restart policies from quality and feature updates. So you can have one over the other and make one longer or shorter should you need to as well. It just means that you can be as flexible as possible as an IT admin to your end users to make sure you're not rebooting things where you're not supposed to and so on. You can also then remove the ability for the end user to pause functionality upgrades as well, right? So you can stop that, and then IT controls that from the get-go, as well as then making sure the IT admins as well can configure things like compliance deadline policies for quality and feature updates. Again, it's just making sure that you provide the right relevance of things like grace periods and so on as well, right? Some of the key considerations as well that we're seeing a lot of people, well, one of the reasons we saw people not going towards things like Intune is around the levels of application support. This has always been something that Intune has been sort of weak at, or most MDMs have been fairly weak at. That's since changed. As of pretty much last year, we're seeing a massive ramp up as part of that. And now in terms of the application types that you can proceed with, the list is ever growing. The big one being things like Win32 apps. Although we say Win32 apps, there is a prep tool that you have to run that Win32 app through. And then off the back of that, you can then go ahead and obviously upload that right into your Intune tenancy. And you can also look to move apps from SCCM into Intune, depending on what they are. You might have multiple things like Windows Store for Business apps. You can look to move those. Web apps, store links, Microsoft Edge is now something you go ahead and deploy from Intune as well as then things like traditional MSIs. So Intune's have also introduced that into the mix as well. It just means that you're no longer reliant on that agent from an SCCM perspective, provided the device has line of sight of the internet and is enrolled into the Intune service. We can now provide those users, obviously, with applications as well, right? So that's one of the big things to consider. In terms of where that application landscape is going, we'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment as well in terms of some of the features and things that Intune will support. But some of the big considerations is once you look to move from something like SCCM or Configuration Manager into Intune only, there are some granularity of management that needs to be considered. So real fine levels of granularity in terms of picking specific updates, specific settings for those updates, and then compliance around that does change. It does change quite drastically into more of a slightly, I wouldn't say indiscriminate, but a more open and sort of liberal way of patching your devices, with a view of then making sure that all those things are driven from the cloud, right? So there are some nuances and some differences. Lots of users are obviously, or sort of end users are happy to accept that, and so businesses. Maintenance windows and active hours is still a very, very important part of this as well, right? And then you'll also find limited sort of support for things like third-party patching support, and that's still something that Microsoft natively aren't the best at. There's limited support for that. There are some good third-party tools out there as well, but you'll find Microsoft does very well, ironically, patching Windows 10 devices with Office 365 apps as well, right? Limited support either side of that, but there are ways and means of mitigating that. If we could please pop over to the next slide, Mr. Mercer. So when we're talking about things like some of the changes between Intune and modern management, I think one of the biggest things organizations struggle with is around the security and manageability of their environment. So in a traditional sense, it's the one thing, if you've ever been an IT admin, you either love it, hate it, or it's both things to you at the same time, and that's things like settings, right? Settings is something that was, again, a sort of a big hindrance in organizations adopting modern management or going towards something such as Intune, because the perception was and the feeling was, and to some extent it still is, depending on how you do it, which I'll cover, limited support for things like settings. So being able to, at a very granular level, right, move things across, right? So, but since then, things like configuration service providers, you heard Phil say CSPs earlier as well. They mean something different here. Just be aware of the acronyms. But effectively, all CSPs do, or policy CSP does, it just exposes the device configuration settings in Windows 10. So it's just an interface between the OS and the configuration settings within the actual provisioning of that device that you can go ahead and then apply as part of that. And there's plenty of things like group policy client extensions that it supports, but you can go ahead and set, modify, delete configurations for pretty much any given feature that exists within Windows. The higher the version of Windows 10, the more functionality you have. So things like registry keys, file permissions, all of those things are, available for you to sort of tweak and sort of play around and turn on or off. Some of the common ones that we work with, just yesterday we were helping a client with things like Cortana, turning that on or off or making certain changes to it as well. AppV, browser cookies, allowing private Defender, power settings, lock screen notifications, and so on as well, right? The admin templates, you guys will know these as like ADMX templates. They just include effectively all the settings available within Windows 10, right? These ADMX templates are available in like a sort of range of services. This is one of the things I will call out. Intune isn't the only MDM that supports this, so to speak. So you can look to upload these admin templates or create admin templates and then import into other MDM solutions as well. And then what that allows you to do is to mimic effectively a group policy type setup within your cloud space. Be careful with that. I would strongly argue to be careful with that. It's a very good opportunity when you do that transition to Windows 10 or even to modern management to sort of shake off the shackles of the past where possible. Would strongly not recommend, just doing a complete shift or copy and paste of Windows settings in ADMX into anything, like Intune. There are some prerequisites to some of this as well. You're gonna have to think about things like no lower than 1709. I would argue if you're on 1709, please move up the ladder as part of this. And a lot of these things, again, are for M365 E3 and E5 clients as well, with things like Azure AD Premium thrown into the mix as well, right? Active Directory, hybrid identity, again, a critical component of this, especially if you're looking to obviously create that transition in that phase. One of the things we're seeing here is how quickly that can be adopted with things like, for example, AD Connect. You can get hybrid identity put in play very, very quickly, because remember, in terms of the modern management side, identity is what's driving the adoption of things like Windows 10. It's what's driving the adoption of your Office 365 or your M365 services, including things like modern management as well, right? Application modernization we've touched on as well. One of the big things to consider here is that you have got a wide range of ways and means of sort of adopting something like this. Windows 32 applications, you can go ahead and take advantage of some of the UWP platform applications as well, or the Apex side of things, MSIX type applications can also now be pumped into that as well. And then you can go ahead, and obviously streamline that deployment with things like Intune, as well as then things like Windows Store for Business as well, should you need to. OS customization, configurations, as we talked about as well, there is going to be some nuances and differences between how you approach that. MDM settings and group policies aren't always the same thing. You can mimic and make sure that, from a compliance perspective, you are fully covered. But we're seeing things like the adoption of OEM images being a big thing now. So Autopilot, which we'll cover in a moment, is a part of that. You can still look to use WIMs and traditional build methodology should you wish to, and then onboard those devices into something like Intune. But overall, things like the policy-based changes and configurations you'll see, which we'll touch on in a minute with things like Autopilot, the approach and the way in which you build devices is going to be something that's very, very different as well, right? Break fix in a modern management world is something that's going to change. You'll find yourself re-enrolling, or an Autopilot reset may be something you consider as opposed to a rebuild. I would argue lots of organizations don't have to bounce a device and put it through Pixie and go through again, perform a Windows reset on that device or a fresh start experience on that device as well. And then off the back of that, things like device provisioning, how that's going to change is something that, all things like Autopilot is looking to mitigate and obviously drive forwards with, right? Which nicely segues me into my last slide as well. So Windows Autopilot is something that I suppose gets heavily associated with something like Intune. It was born out of the Windows Store for Business side of things. It is free to use. It's not exclusive to Intune, by the way. You can use this, for a sort of number of devices and reasons. But traditionally, as you see on the slide here, the idea from Microsoft perspective was your hardware vendor, you purchase from your favorite one, which HP, Dell, whoever that might be. Those device IDs can then be either uploaded to the cloud. So that device ID that I'm talking about in terms of how the Autopilot process works, it's referred to as a hardware hash. That hardware hash is unique to that device. You'll have multiple hardware hashes. So if you've bought 50 devices, you'll have 50. Those devices are then imported into your Azure tenancy. You can do that through Intune or the Windows Store for Business service, which then effectively means those device IDs are then registered to your business or your Azure tenancy specifically, right? And off the back of that, we can go as ITs, configure various profiles and bits and pieces. And then off the back of that, we can then ship those devices, or we can hand those devices out as well, right? We can then, we can have that experience. We here at PowerOn work under that exact premise. So if I need a new device, the guys ship it to me, I can just open it up, provided I've got an internet connection, I can log on. All of that's being driven through things like Intune and Autopilot, and obviously then everything that wraps around it from an Azure Active Directory perspective, right? And that end user can also self-deploy. I'll quickly touch on some of the ways and means in which Autopilot can be used as well. A big trick as well is that this can also be used for existing devices within your organization. It's not a bad idea to have those hardware hashes registered in your Azure tenancy under your control. And then off the back of that, as I said, as people come and go, you need to do anything with devices. You can literally, in a user-driven scenario from Windows Autopilot, the user unboxes the device, they plug it in, they turn it on. I think they have to select the language, the locale, and the keyboard, connect it to a wireless network, specify their email address and password, and there you go. Off the back of that, that's the user-driven model for something like Windows Autopilot. It makes that user far more self-sufficient. It massively decreases the reliance on IT because IT have done all the work in the background. And then away you go. The other things to consider from an Autopilot perspective, there's something called self-deploying mode. For me, I would recommend self-deploying mode for things like kiosk devices or digital signing device or shared devices. Or the way that works is that self-deploying mode joins the device into Azure AD. It enrolls the device into Intune at the same time, or any other MDM service, again, not unique to Intune. Off the back of that, leveraging Azure AD for automatic MDN enrollment, which we talked about earlier as well, to make sure that things like your policies, wherever they come from, it could be MDM, could be CSPs, could be those admin templates we spoke about, the apps, the certs, profiles for networking, for Wi-Fi, whatever the case may be, is there, and then there's a single status page for that user to then go ahead, and just log on, as I said, either through a kiosk mode or a sort of shared device. The one that's been grabbing a lot of attention, as well as something in terms of Autopilot, is white glove. It's effectively a fairly straightforward provisioning process. So the time-consuming part of that process is performed by IT. So you would have to make sure, believe me, I've done this in testing, has to have an Ethernet connection in the back in order for this to function. I don't know whether that's changed. I'll be corrected by maybe Steve in a moment. You go ahead and you configure that device. Once all of that's done, you can then obviously go ahead and pass that back to your end user. So the experience would be a simple logon process with everything beautifully configured, the device enrolled into Intune. And then off the back of that as well, I said you could do the exact same thing with existing devices as well, right? I think I'm okay for time. Are we kind of moving on to the open Q&A?
Yeah, I think from a time perspective, it's probably good opportunity to move into the Q&A. So thank you for that, Heinrich, as well. So just for those, we've had a few questions come in as well, which is great. So we can start to look to go through these. As we were saying, hopefully that's going to give you some flavors around both information, readiness, and steps. And I'm sure potentially invoked a number of questions in minds that have been looking at this type of stuff. So do feel free to ask, anything and everything now. It's the opportunity to go through. And like I say, we're just going to keep this fairly informal. So, feel free to ask your questions in terms of whatever kind of relational format it means to you. It's always good to try and make it fairly personalized to your situation, because there's normally lots of people going through the same kind of thing as well. But just to start, we had a couple of bits and pieces. One question around things like the CMG was, when the CMGs are in place, is there any kind of logic to the client choosing between CMG or local distribution when on network? Or what's the kind of management kind of difference between the two?
Yeah, so when the device is physically on premises and is subject to things like AD sites and services, IP subnets, and however you've configured your boundaries in ConfigMgr, that's what controls where it should go to and talk. So as long as your boundaries are configured and you have set the option to say, when you are zoned into this boundary in ConfigMgr, go talk to this internal on-premises distribution point, it won't randomly wander off out to the cloud CMG and download content. There is an option, and this is where that whole remote and branch office scenario comes into play. You can deliberately configure a boundary to say, when you are here, then please do prefer to go out to the internet and get the content rather than traversing expensive WAN links, etc. So it's absolutely in your control as to when and where a client will go talk to cloud management distribution points, and that's based on the configuration within the boundaries.
Okay, thank you for that. There was a question in regards to the Intune side. So interestingly, we touched on it very briefly, but what products would we recommend? Oops, sorry, more questions popping in. Let me just pop that out so I can see them all. So what products would we recommend for updating third-party applications in Intune?
We use PatchMyPC, so is a good partner that we team up with. They've recently kind of launched a Win32 app catalog that you can pump into your Intune tenancy, and off the back of that, you can go ahead and deploy those patches as apps themselves. So you can be very specific and targeted in how you go ahead and do that. But PatchMyPC seems to have a fairly robust solution at the moment.
Okay, it's probably also fair to say that you do need to start thinking then a little bit differently with respect to it. So as Heinrich's saying there, essentially what we actually use PatchMyPC and ConfigMgr as well to have a third-party patch catalog made available to then update things like the automated deployment rules and the other pieces to push out on a traditional mindset of patching. With respect to the Intune, because it doesn't actually have very good support for third-party, you could start going down weird and wonderful scripting and get very complicated to try and achieve a similar mindset in terms of patching. But the process is really kind of starting to adapt to, rather than patching of the devices, it's kind of software updating, if you will. So it's basically pushing out newer versions of the applications as they are released. So it's is your kind of alternative method with Intune, because it doesn't really support third-party patching in a very robust way at the moment. So there is that product that we just mentioned there. That's PatchMyPC. That's one of the better ones we've seen with Intune integration, or one of the few, to be honest with you as well, where essentially then it makes that patching catalog, which effectively is just the new versions of application update sides, really, in some respects, although a bit gross simplification. It makes it available to the Intune service, so you can then distribute those updated software packages. I think, Steve, I know you've kind of touched on some of the bits and pieces with that with customers as well.
Yeah, so not to go over basically how you described it, because that's absolutely spot on. It's just to stress that main point that they are not, in the truest sense, updates, as in like you would be used to with ConfigMgr in the WSUS world and stuff. They are treated as an upgrade application and deployed as applications. But
Yeah.
it's the best way to handle getting your device at a good security level, because that's the main reason why stuff is updated, is to close security vulnerabilities and gaps and occasionally provide new features. And without that, then you are left to manually packaging up the applications and the time it takes to find out how to get it to successfully upgrade. Whereas with the partners of Patch My PC, it just makes it a lot easier because they do a lot of that heavy lifting for you through the process of publishing it.
Absolutely, and the other thing to consider there as well is the intent of why you're patching. Is it to add new functionality, feature sets, whatever the case may be, or is it a security thing? So those two things can be treated very differently. But ultimately, yes, Patch My PC at the moment has definitely got the answers for that, depending on how you identify your needs. Is the main point.
Great. And then we mentioned branch cache earlier on in the session around, kind of content support for CMGs and things like that. What from our experience do we typically see branch cache achieving when supporting content distribution?
Oh, that's a how long's a piece of string question, that one. So there are so many different factors involved in this, and the types of applications, the compression ratios of the sources and so on. But it can be quite easily as high as about an 80+% bandwidth saving, very easily, and then you can just build on top of that. But it does come down to what it is that you're trying to distribute, how many devices are on to serve that content, how often that content gets changed, and so on. One thing I will add on top of that, though, from another question that I've seen on there, is what other options surround that whole, well, the question actually is, how can we limit the amount of bandwidth that's used by sites for downloading it and home broadband with low internet connection? So obviously the whole branch cache stuff isn't going to solve the world for home internet connections. You are going to have to rely on people that are working from home having an amount of bandwidth to be able to download the content from the internet. And obviously it saves on your internal bandwidth, as I mentioned, so from your organization's internet pipe perspective, you don't have to worry there because you're offloading it to the cloud. But in them branch scenarios or on premises when you're using Intune, then there is some considerations on how you limit the amount of stuff that's coming down via the pipe. Branch cache being one of them. So cloud gateways absolutely leverage the branch cache technology, and that can be very easily just turned on with clients to use that distributed branch cache side to limit there. But especially when you get to Windows 10, and this then applies more for the Intune side as well, if you're using it at scale for delivering applications to a large number of devices, delivery optimization comes into play quite heavily. So delivery optimization being a Windows 10 feature side and is supported for both Windows 10 updates and now Win32 apps delivered via Intune as well. And that will do a similar thing in terms of that peer-to-peer side, but then naturally leverages the things go into Windows 10 to be able to poll the service to say, where are my nearest neighbors, what are counted as close, and then go find that content and cache it for reuse elsewhere as well. So if you currently have either delivery optimization disabled or set to a non-optimized fashion, you should absolutely be looking at making sure that delivery optimization is configured for the best usage possible. And then if you're running hybrid with Intune and ConfigMgr, there is a new role called what used to be called the Doink server, which I still love that name, but it's now the Microsoft Connected Cache server or something, which will allow you to basically have a server that intelligently caches all of the Windows updates and the Win32 apps from Intune at the edge, and then uses that to distribute it to all stuff internally.
Cool, thanks for that. So we had a question actually, so the CSP side of things. So jumping in a little bit to then that it was good one. It was mentioned the tenancies it does not support if provisioned by a CSP for CMGs. What options would a customer have if they have implemented their config manager in a CMG, which I believe that's the phrasing. So if their config exists in currently a CSP-based Azure tenancy,
in the Azure tenancy,
the cloud solution provider side.
Yeah. So because the CSP subscriptions do not have any of what referred to as the ASM, the Azure Service Management APIs, you cannot provision a cloud management gateway into a CSP Azure provided subscription, so one that is ARM only. The only ways around that is to start to look at bringing in either a pay-as-you-go or an enterprise agreement-based Azure subscription and linking that into your Azure AD subscription to be able to then say, I want to target this specifically to be commissioned in this new Azure subscription. So you do have to separate it away from any other resources that you currently have deployed in a CSP-based Azure subscription. Like I say, easiest way, you can absolutely just spin up a pay-as-you-go one, just find a credit card or something to be able to run the costs on that off, or go and set up with your licensing providers an EA-based Azure subscription to commission it in.
Yeah, and that's just for the actual CMGs.
That's just for the CMG. Yeah, you can leave everything else. You don't have to move other bits and pieces, but just the CMG service itself has to go sit separated.
Great, thanks for that. We then had one in respect to the Autopilot. So do you need to allow users may join devices to Azure AD if the device hash has been added to the Autopilot or into Autopilot?
It depends, yes. So if you wish to use Autopilot, then yes. Your end users will obviously need to, depending on the profile, you need to select or create for that device, then yes. But that hardware hash is just a way of identifying the actual device. The hardware hash itself has no relevance whether that device is then joined or enrolled into the Intune service. That happens post-completion of the Windows Autopilot profile running. And then as part of that profile running, the end steps are, well, one of the first ones are to obviously join Azure Active Directory. You could do a hybrid join as well, by the way. But there's nothing stopping that end user from, I suppose, still joining that device to Azure Active Directory, even if the hardware hash isn't in Autopilot. The hardware hash is just a precursor to start that off. It's a way of the Autopilot service knowing which device it's going to run this profile on. The end user is of no significance, but he or she would need to have permissions to do an Azure Active Directory join in order to complete that if it was in a user-driven scenario, so to speak.
Great. All right, thanks for that. Hopefully that answers the question. I had another one here that was around, we talked to the Autopilot there around also being able to ship devices directly to users. What do you need for Autopilot to build devices remotely? Or does it? Does it is probably a different way of phrasing it, but obviously not necessarily a way.
So I'm just going to jump in on this one, Heinrich, sorry. So you have two main scenarios for Autopilot outside of the whole user-driven stuff. So it's either pure Azure AD only joined, in which case your only major requirement, as long as the backend and the hash is there and stuff, is an internet connection. User runs through it, it talks to the cloud and joins it and commissions policies and apps, etc. If it is a hybrid join scenario, so you want it joined in your traditional on-premises Active Directory and Azure AD, then the main requirement is they actually has to be currently internally within your network when you run through the process, because it has to be able to talk to them domain controllers to do that domain join process.
Okay. So just additional questions then around some of that. Well, this isn't quite an Autopilot part, but can you deploy Windows 10 from the cloud, I believe, in a traditional way? So I'm guessing more than
where you've got a Windows. So like where you've got a Windows 7 machine and you want to get it up to Windows 10.
I will interpret it that way. Yeah.
Technically. Go on, Heinrich, with your it depends.
Well, if you're a Power on Pulse customer, then the answer is yes. So we've developed the capability of performing in-place upgrades of Windows 7 devices to Windows 10. And that's heavily mitigated and used in conjunction with our SCCM, the cloud service, basically. So yes, there are ways and means in which to accomplish that from a cloud perspective. There are some caveats to that, however, but in terms of an Intune perspective, your options are very limited. So there's no native capability to effectively, in a traditional sense, pixie boot that device, take the OS off, and then apply a Windows 10 custom image over the top of that. You would be required to look through other avenues, either upgrade the device a different way or have an OEM Windows 10 image or a pre-purchased device, so to speak. So it does depend. And you could probably clarify a bit more on that, Steve, as well.
No,
I want to make sure that we put all the caveats out there.
No, you're right. Basically, if you're an Intune only, then you're out of luck basically on that side. It's for managing Windows 10 devices that are already on Windows 10. You can take it through the life cycle potentially as it goes on with the servicing rings and stuff, but you cannot take it from 7 to 10 with Intune. With ConfigMgr, like I say, we've done a lot of work to be able to implement that with some other custom extensions, bits and pieces, so that we can. And if you are pure native ConfigMgr, you can start to look at doing in-place task sequence upgrades, which still kind of unnerves me sometimes on doing that Windows 7 to Windows 10 in-place upgrade. I would much prefer to do a wipe and a reload, because it's your chance to actually start right and wipe out some of the sins of the past and get Windows 10 correct. But at a very long push or hard push, you can start to look at leveraging that in place. Don't change your apps, don't change your settings, take it up from 7 to 10. But again, there's caveats, testing, and all the rest of it. Content needs to be stored locally and so on.
That's probably actually a reasonable segue into two or so questions, where essentially it would be, well, one was why would I need to keep or use SCCM if I have Intune, but also like what would be the limitations of Intune, which I suppose anyway, I won't answer it, but I might do in a minute. But the question, I guess, would also be phrasing it in probably a response of two ways, right? Before and after Windows 7.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that question as well. So I've got the basic summarization of it. Intune or ConfigMgr? Without doing the usual typical consultancy style answer of it depends, it absolutely really depends, doesn't it? Intune is ideal. Heinrich, chip in on this one when you see fit. Intune is ideal where you are either brand new, a greenfield estate, where you are very heavily driven already into that, to overuse the term, the modern management side, where you have simplified your application and your management stack. So if you are heavily invested in the M365 stack, you're using Microsoft Defender for your AV, using BitLocker, using ATP for extended security, you are using mainly SaaS-based apps, you don't have any really old legacy Borland and Fox Pro and stuff and things that install all over the place and need admin rights, then Intune would probably suffice for yourselves, and especially if you are just pure Windows 10. That's what it was designed for. It was designed for that modern world. So if you've gone through a lot of that effort or you are starting fresh, absolutely, Intune is a very heavy consideration to start with. Now, if you're already invested in ConfigMgr, or you have that traditional style, I'm not going to say legacy because it's quite common still, so that traditional style infrastructure, then ConfigMgr has many benefits to use in conjunction with Intune. It's not to say it's one or the other, it's absolutely not. So that hybrid approach where we use ConfigMgr for absolutely supporting the Windows 7 machines, because you're not bringing them into Intune, to use ConfigMgr to get you to Windows 10, to use ConfigMgr where you have complex applications, deep customizations that you need to apply to your estate, and then being able to offload and send up to the Intune service rich data for analytics, so things like desktop analytics, the incoming user experience analytics, so leveraging things like ConfigMgr to gather that data and send it to the cloud services to then present it to then be able to branch out to when they are connected to the internet, perform interactions with your on-premise config manager as like that portal interface to it, has its benefits at that stage. Now, Heinrich, you showed that whole slidey bar as you start to offload the workloads, and that's where it is kind of that approach, isn't it, to say, as you tackle one of them areas and go, right, we've done some work, we've simplified the estate, we want to offload the patching now to Intune, so we don't have to worry about config manager and its ADRs and lots of software update groups. We just want to say, basically, just go patch on these time schedules. You then slide that across and offload that workload to Intune. So always thinking about that migration path to start to say workload offload. I want that over there now. I want that over there now, but still having that rich, very, very deep tool set with config manager while you're doing that migration, while you simplify, is my usual approach and conversation part for that.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I think the conversation shifted massively with things like the introduction of Endpoint Manager itself as a service, as a holistic service that's comprised of a few components. So the question becomes, well, in my mind anyway, no longer a one of one or the other. It's probably both. You'll find yourself, switching workloads, as Steve said, and so on. The other big driver as well is SCCM. Make no bones about it. It's a complicated product. There's a lot of moving parts. You have to be very good at it. It takes a lot of watering and feeding. And you would argue to some extent it's for the purist, but that purist sort of tool set was born out of the necessity of what enterprises wanted. And they still need a lot of that today. So you will find yourself flicking between one and the other. Plus, some clientele and end users prefer the ease of use of something like Intune. Does it patch? Yes. Can it deploy apps? Yes. That's good enough. So it all does depend, but you will find yourself potentially using two, especially if you're an existing config manager owner or user of.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like you just said there, that change that Microsoft made to Endpoint Manager makes this one product in essence.
Yeah, exactly.
You would really be pushed now to say, right, I'm just going to go and only implement config manager on premise and not integrate it at all. That just doesn't make any sort of sense. You should absolutely say it's one product. You have config manager and Intune, and it's then deciding which workloads you use where and which interfaces and so on. The other flip side is obviously if you, like I say, absolutely brand new modern, don't have anything, then you consider starting with Intune, see how far you get, and then you might need to consider then retrofitting config manager for some stuff, and especially with some of the stuff that Microsoft are introducing, which are cloud focused in the console, but require config manager in the background to actually use them. Again, it's kind of really blurring them lines these days.
Yeah. So in conclusion, it depends.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I kind of probably throw in an alternative point of view. I still disagree with the use both mindset, right? In terms of, unless you are what you said there, Steve, a primary of config manager, then you add Intune to extend capabilities around mobile phones and other bits and pieces. But operationally standing, using both for me adds additional complexity to your team. It really comes down from an IT management or a business perspective, from my side at least, is you need to choose operationally whether you've got the time and money to invest in a team set to have the enterprise grade skill set to use config manager effectively and use config and Intune together effectively. And if you don't, then you either need to look, to be fairly straight, to a partner to maybe circumvent that if you do need that capability, or you accept the shortcomings that are currently present from a modern mobile management approach. Modern mobile management, though, can still deliver a good enough service for many enterprises.
Absolutely.
And I do say enterprises in that context. We do managed services for customers with Intune only for international advertising firms with thousands of users. So it's not that it's not possible, but it comes with a range of caveats. The interesting side of things is going back to one of the points Heinrich made actually early on in the session around Microsoft used to have a pure cloud message, like go cloud first, go Intune, and just replace ConfigMgr. And that was the message they were hitting for quite a while, which gave a level of confusion and also frustration to customers when they've then changed their mindset or positioning now to say and use both, because isn't that the easy answer? I would say it's an easy Microsoft answer, not necessarily an easy operational answer from a team base, but it will start to cause additional frustrations for customers where they've gone an Intune only path, where Microsoft are now bringing their Windows as a service capabilities are starting to have dependencies back on Config Manager now in a more substantive way. So if you want things like the desktop analytics capabilities to be able to do better, kind of granular inventory and pre-readiness assessment checks, or the new stuff coming through with user analytics to start to see around user performance and the actual kind of experience your user getting, in flight, it needs Config Manager. So it comes back to an operational question, really. Do you have either the internal capacity, time, and money to invest in the enterprise skill set to use the tools? Because having them is one thing, using them effectively is the more important thing. Or do you look towards partnering for those kind of specialist capabilities, or accepting a kind of modern way of doing it, which will come with certain shortcomings? But it's subjective. Everyone's going to have their point of view, and you'll probably even within a company get an agreement on exactly what is the absolute best approach, because it does come down to a level of personal preference. It's whether you're willing to accept certain shortcomings over functional capability and all that kind of good stuff as well. Just being conscious of time as we are nearing the close of the session as well. We do really thank you for those obviously that joining us today, because obviously we appreciate these are quite long sessions, but we do try and make them hopefully as informative and useful for you as possible. There was just one more that I was going to just call out, but there's a few more bits and pieces. So if there are any last questions, feel free just to drop them in now, and we'll try and cover them off in the next 5 minutes. But do end users need admin permissions to complete a Autopilot enrollment? Was one of the questions.
No.
Okay.
And I would recommend you don't give your end users admin permissions. Delegated permissions is definitely the way to go. The same thing with SCCM and app installations. It uses the system account. And with Autopilot as well, a big thing to consider there, something we haven't touched on, but it's the first time in the history of Windows where you can provision a device without there being a local administrator account on the device in the first place. So the answer is no, and keep it that way if at all possible.
Okay, sounds good. I think then, is there any last questions, Heinrich, Steve, that you feel would be worth covering off? Otherwise, I think we will start to draw this to a close.
No, there was no.
Okay. Great. Well, everyone, thank you obviously for joining us today. Just in terms of then the final bits, basically just to quickly say, you probably get the ideas from hopefully the content that we shared. It's things like just making sure you've got stuff like the necessary licensing, of course, and the user subscriptions in place to be able to kind of start to leverage any of these benefits if you're not already. But do feel free, if you do have any questions, to kind of speak to us, or throw in other bits and pieces if we haven't covered them off today. And also what we'd say is, if you found today's session useful, if you wanted to suggest topics that you feel would be useful for yourself and teams, then do feel to throw those in. Or if you wanted just to even pick up on some direct questions, then also do feel free just to kind of reach out to us. We're quite happy to share the wealth, as it were, or share the knowledge, and then we can certainly see around how we can assist you from that perspective as well. Of course, if those would actually need some more tangible support, we of course are here to help. We do ranges of stuff from consultancy to managed support and managed services and other bits and pieces as well, so can fit your needs, whether it's just some advice or right through to actually helping you take these things on ongoing. And again, just feel free to reach out to us. But other than that, I would say thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Steve and Heinrich as well for supporting the session today, and we'll bring that to a close.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Great.